processes that addresses issues related to violence, harm, pleasure, and consent online. And as I said, the session today is a dialogue on this topic, on these 4 topics: violence, harm, pleasure, and consent, and how we should work on improving that and making sure that these topics are being addressed at IGF and other internet governance related forums, and it's also being addressed in a correct and non-repressive manner. We will start with the presentation of the BPF draft report delivered by Sorina. Sorina Teleno is our BPF consultant for this year. And then we're going to go into 2 shorter panels with our panelists, who will be Avri Doria, who is a researcher at Technicalities, Jennifer Chung, Director of Corporate Knowledge at Asia, and Henri van der Spuy, Fellow at Research ICT Africa. Hopefully we'll be joined by Koliwe Majawa from APC as well, but she might be having some issues with the agenda today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor to Sorina, and hopefully she will conduct a very comprehensive presentation of our previous draft report, which was a great work from her. So Sorina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bruna. Hello, everyone, and special thanks to our guests who have woken up quite early in their morning to join us for this session. So many thanks for that. I'll try to go as fast as possible through our long report. I'm not sure if you've actually had the time and the chance to go through it all, so we'll try to just explain a bit how we got there, what were some of the main findings as we were looking at the IGF itself, and then focusing a bit more on the recommendations that the BPF has put forward, and we can continue the discussion from there. So let me try to share my screen. And you should be able to see it. All right, so the best practice forum on gender. As Bruna has said, this year the thematic focus has been on 4 key issues, and these were violence, harm, pleasure, and consent. Yeah, sorry for the bad typing, from a gender diversity perspective. And the focus was on the IGF itself, trying to see whether and how these 4 thematic issues have been brought up at the IGF over the past 4 years, basically when the new mandate of the IGF started, and then whether and how the IGF has fostered the participation of women and gender diverse people in its activities in general and in discussions focused on the 4 thematic issues. What we did, we conducted a quite in-depth analysis of sessions held at the IGF over the last 4 years. We looked at session descriptions, reports, where they were available. Not everyone apparently is submitting a report after an IGF session, and at session transcripts. We also conducted a public survey. We received only 30 contributions, but those we received were very valuable. We also conducted a series of interviews with members of the IGF community, the IGF Secretariat, and the MAG chair. And many thanks to those of you who took time to guide us through some of your experiences with the IGF and with gender inclusion in general. And then we also looked at contributions submitted into the usual IGF taking stock processes, which happen at the end of one IGF cycle and before the start of another IGF cycle. So based on all of that, our report is focused on 2 main issues, as I've just said at the beginning. And the first one is, again, how gender issues have featured at the IGF with the focus on violence, harm, pleasure, and consent online from the gender diversity perspective. And what you can see, I hope, on the screen are the basically key findings on these issues. And the first one is that while the IGF has indeed featured discussion on gender-based violence and harm, and we've seen that over the past 4 years, there hasn't been so much focus on issues related to pleasure, consent, self-expression, and alike. And it seems basically that there is a tendency to focus more on problems and negative issues and not emphasize what still needs to be done to promote the internet as a space for self-expression and pleasure with consent as a guiding principle. This is something you will find in the report. These are some of the numbers behind our research and some of the percentages. I just skip it quickly because otherwise I will spend too much time on it. And again, some of the key findings also based on those numbers that you've just seen. So basically the percentage of IGF sessions that are focused exclusively on gender issues is sort of constantly low. So it's between 3% and 7% across the 4 years. But there is a positive and encouraging trend, I would say, showing an increasing number of sessions that integrate gender-related issues within other discussions on other internet and digital policy topics. And this has increased from 19% in 2016 to 41% in 2019, which is quite good, I would say. Then the percentage of sessions dedicated to the BPF thematic issues, again, violence, harm, pleasure, and consent, or all consent, has been relatively constant across the 4 years, oscillating between 2 and 6%. And one general observation across all the years that we have looked at, again, scanning through session transcripts and reports and everything else, is that gender issues tend to be discussed mostly in relation to access and inclusion. This is just a very, very quick overview at some of the topics that have been featuring in discussions, IGF sessions related to consent, self-expression, and pleasure. I'll just move next. And here, obviously, you see that there have been more discussions on issues related to violence and harm. And this is, these are a few examples of topics that have been discussed. And the second broad issue that we looked at was the inclusion of women and gender diverse people, both in the IGF itself at large and also in discussions related to the 4 thematic issues. And some of the key findings: IGF discussions on violence, harm, pleasure, and consent do exceptionally well, I guess it's expected, in terms of gender diversity among speakers, moderators, and participants. But of course, this is only valid in terms of men-women diversity, because that's the only thing we could actually assess looking at IGF data. The overall general feeling among the people we've been talking with is that there has been good progress over the years to foster better gender diversity, but of course there's always room for improvement. And as I've just said, there is no mechanism in place to measure the inclusion and participation of gender non-binary people. And for that, we need some more disaggregated data to be able to look at these things as well. And now moving into the recommendations section, I'll try to go as fast as possible through them. We also have a few categories of recommendations here. The first broad topic is around gender mainstreaming at the IGF. And quickly, we would like to suggest to the IGF to continue encouraging the integration of gender-related issues within discussions on other internet and digital policy issues, building on the positive trends I mentioned a bit earlier. A suggestion for the MAG to maybe consider including a question in the IGF workshop proposal forms, inviting session organizers to indicate how they plan to approach, or whether they plan to approach, the proposed topics from a gender diversity perspective. And looking a bit at the gender report cards, which have been, I would say, a bit unused over the past few years, to maybe assess them a bit and see if they could be made mandatory for all session organizers, but then really use them to conduct some sort of an analysis. And while discussions dedicated only to gender issues should still happen, it is important to ensure that these discussions are not only attracted the communities they are referring to, so go a bit beyond the usual circles and the usual suspects. Then reaffirmation, I would say, of the fact that the inclusion of gender in the debates is a two-way responsibility. Of course, it has to be encouraged from the top by the MAG, the IGF Secretariat, and so, but the community should also be a bit more proactive in requesting gender-related discussions or gender mainstreaming whenever it feels like this is more needed. And also the IGF intersessional work should promote a bit more discussions and linkages between the best practice forums and dynamic coalitions in order to foster or allow for more interdisciplinarity. Then on issues related to violence, harm, pleasure, and consent, our recommendations are the following. Encourage more discussions on empowerment, self-expression, pleasure, and consent, as women and gender diverse people experiences online are not and should not be limited to harm and violence issues. And the recommendation, which is sort of dear to us, the IGF has the opportunity to become the main space that fosters discussions on how to empower and uplift women and gender diverse people in the digital space, and it should not miss this opportunity. Then making sure that discussions on the 4 issues do not happen again inside bubbles, but they reach and include the wider IGF community and even beyond the IGF community. On gender diversity, as I've said earlier, there is a need for more disaggregated data to be able to fully assess the degree of gender diversity across the overall IGF. And the MAG and the Secretariat here could consider developing some sort of a mechanism to measure the inclusion and participation of gender non-binary people. And we do acknowledge this is not an easy task. It would be quite difficult to figure this out. And this is why we suggest the inclusion of gender diverse people in a conversation on whether and how such a mechanism could be built. Then the gender diversity principle should apply, of course, across all sessions, including those focused on gender issues, and avoiding echo chambers, once again, is an important thing. And then another thing which is sort of dear to us, the participation of women and gender diverse people in sessions and in other IGF activities should not be tokenized. So just having women on the panel should not be the end goal. It's also about empowering these people to participate, contribute to the discussion, and not only in one session, but then actually going beyond that and seeing how else they can contribute to IGF work. And related to this is the recommendation to go beyond capacity building to also develop confidence building for those who work on gender issues at the IGF and maybe beyond as well. Another important recommendation is to work more closely with other organizations that are active and actively engaged in gender-related issues and creating more linkages with the communities at the local and regional level. Another specific recommendation is to use the famous or infamous list of resource persons that the IGF is putting together to help session organizers have more gender diversity in sessions. And here there are a few specific recommendations for the Secretariat and the MAG's consideration. And then when discussing approaches for fostering more gender diversity at the IGF, we should seek input from the targeted community. So not try to solve problems without involving these specific communities. Then it should not only be about the workshops and sessions that happen at the annual IGF meeting, but also look at IGF best practice forums in general, dynamic coalitions, various MAG working groups or community working groups. They would also benefit from having some sort of a gender assessment in terms of how they are thinking and addressing gender participation and topics of gender in their work. On the capacity development building side, there is also the issue of trying to allocate more funds to encourage the participation of less represented gender communities. And we know funding is always a challenging issue, but we could not miss this recommendation. I've already covered the gender report card, so I'll skip that. And another recommendation is to encourage innovative session formats within the annual IGF meeting as a way to foster some sort of cross-pollination and break the silos, you know, in which we have, again, the same people having the same conversations. And related to the MAG, because we also looked at this and also based on some of the discussions we had during the interviews, we have 2 main recommendations. One is for the UN itself. When appointing MAG members, the Secretary General should also look at whether there are candidates that do have expertise on gender issues, because simply having women, for example, on the MAG does not necessarily mean that expertise on gender issues is present. And then when the call for nominations for the MAG is open, it might be useful if we make it somehow more clear that gender diversity is about basically everyone, so not only men and women. And that might encourage gender diverse people to get into the process. And the final thing that I'm going to cover is our recommendation for some further work that the IGF could take up. And this is also because of the fact that the best practice forum this year didn't really have enough resources and capacity to go beyond just looking at the IGF. And that's basically, first of all, mapping policy processes and spaces that discuss the 4 issues in the digital space from a gender diversity perspective, then mapping policy processes and spaces that discuss, again, violence, harm, pleasure, and consent from a gender diversity perspective, but not necessarily in an internet or digital context, and then trying to bring these communities somehow together in the framework of the IGF by inviting them to contribute to IGF discussions and activities focused on these issues. And that's basically it. Our report was published a couple of weeks ago. It's online. It's still open for public comment until the end of the IGF, so that's not so much. We only have a few days left, but if you would like to add to our recommendations, add more suggestions, just please do send us an email by next Tuesday. And many thanks. Back to Bruna and Marwa.
Thank you very much, Sorina, for the presentation of our draft report. And maybe just highlighting some of the recommendations and bridging them with one of the comments in the chat. Juan Pajaro, there was a comment about how we should make IGF more friendly for gender diverse people. And this was definitely some of the recommendations and things we have been hearing at the BPF space for years now on how even the registration form isn't welcoming enough for the gender diverse community and so on. So these are ways that we wanted to also kick off this conversation, but also the BPF Gender, although the name is BPF Gender and Access, we welcome this community and we really could profit from broader discussions on these topics and moving just for beyond. We have been trying to move beyond the female access and just framing this as women and so on. So we could definitely profit from this community inside the BPF. I'm gonna hand the floor now to Marwa. Marwa Azomat is one of the other BPF co-facilitators and my fellow co-moderator for today's session. So Marwa, you have the floor if you have, if you're here. Oh.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruna, and hey everyone. This is Marwa, and I'm also working at the Association for Progressive Communications as a policy advocacy coordinator. And today I'm very happy to see this culminating. Yeah, it's been so many months of work, and I would like to thank Sorina for leading this process. So it's really great to see that coming out finally. And just to begin with the thematic around violence, harm, pleasure, and consent, it's been very hard to really find that sort of position for this thematic within the realm of internet governance and digital rights space. Because it's a thematic that's leaning towards feminist practices, but it also needs to be more consolidated from a policy perspective, but also within the internet-related spaces. And because we know that if we are to build safe spaces for women without undermining their agency, because that protectionist approach can have a chilling effect on freedom of expression and women's ownership of their online experience. But also when it comes to translating feminist work around consent and pleasure into policy recommendations, it's very hard to just have this policy-centered perspective that would really speak to different stakeholders. And so for today's panel, we have Henry with us. And unfortunately, Kaliwe couldn't join. So good news is that we would be speaking with you, Henry, for the whole panel. but would also open the floor for interventions from the panelists and participants. So basically, my question to you, Henri, is that do you think this thematic has developed in the context of internet governance and digital rights space? Yeah, floor is yours.
Thanks, Marwa. And also just thank you to everyone who's worked so hard on this initiative. As someone who in the past was involved more intricately, I know how hard it is to, and it's very joyful, but it can also be very hard to put a best practice forum together. So congratulations on this work. I've really enjoyed reading your report and I think it's fantastic. And I think you've started a lot of conversations and steered the best practice forum into a new direction, which I'm very excited about, because I think there's a lot of potential in there. And with that, thanks, I think it's maybe useful to pause and look back a little bit at where we're coming from, because I think that might help us understand to some extent where we're going to, given that there's a lot of recommendations in there that we can build upon. And maybe I think Avery will also be able to jump in on this, and Henriette and some of the people who've been involved in the Internet Governance Forum for a longer period of time than I have. But so I say this with the caveat that I joined the IGF and I think it was 2015. And was immediately roped into helping the Best Practice Forum on Gender, which was a little bit like baptism by fire for me, to be honest, because it was a very interesting year in that we discussed the topic of online abuse and gender-based violence, which then also became sort of the Best Practice Forum became the sort of subject or the object of a group of trolls affiliated to the Gamergate controversy in the US. So a lot of people will remember this. It was not an easy time for a lot of participants. And it also was actually, it became a very good case study of how much we still need to do in this space in terms of enabling people to talk about online abuse and gender-based violence. I know for my own purposes, it really highlighted to me how people don't understand yet properly that online abuse is a real form of abuse. And I think that sort of, it's a common theme in my work and research since then, because I think understanding online risks better and sort of seeing it as a real risk is something that a lot of policymakers still don't get. So I say this, with this sort of idea of looking back. I think, as I mentioned, I hope Henriette and Avery can also help on this. I know when I had conversations with Jack Key, who used to be with the Association for Progressive Communications and was leading this group for the first 2 or 3 years, I remember her saying to me that it took a long time for the IGF to actually put gender on the agenda. And also to get a best practice forum. I mean, the best practice forum on gender started in the second year of best practice forums. And it took quite a lot of sort of convincing to get to that point. So I think it's quite important to take that sort of look back and realize how far we've come to some extent, and to realize that this is also going to become a continuous struggle. I think it's really interesting when you read this report that we are now getting into a more nuanced understanding of what we mean by gender, and the fact that we need to sort of unpack issues around positive and negative rights or freedoms too, and then also the need to go beyond just binary notions of gender, which I think is great in this report, and it's great that we are looking at these things. So I just wanted to give that sort of brief background, because I think it's important to know where we're coming from before just sort of analyzing and trying to understand where we are now. I think broadly speaking, Marwa, you asked about to what extent the themes of pleasure and harm and violence are now common across internet governance spaces. In my experience, I think it has become more common, but I still think I'm always surprised at how uncommon it is in some spaces. So I think what Serena mentioned about the fact that you see in sort of we still have a very sort of siloed approach to dealing with these issues. And just one recent example is Chennai and a couple of us were involved in making a submission in South Africa to Parliament around a new domestic violence amendment bill. And it took some real convincing trying to get parliamentarians or policymakers to realize and to believe us when we try to convince them that the online dimension of domestic violence is something real that we need to study and understand. And partly the problem is that there's so little data out there, which is why it's great that, you know, the Best Practice Forum has tried to sort of unpack some of the data that is out there, because we really need that sort of data in order to better address these problems. Without that data, we really are sort of trying to address things while being blind. I think the point that you make in the report about the emphasis being on more negative constructions of rights, so sort of freedom from being abused, etc. That's very true. I think we see very little focus on the more empowering aspects of freedom. But again, given sort of the experiences that I've had outside of this space, or outside of the digital space, I still think there's a need to talk about the risks and the harms, etc. Because I think it's easy for us, because we're in this world and we sort of deal with it a lot, to think it is very common and people realize that there is such a thing as online abuse. But as soon as you step outside of our little bubble, it's not very common and people don't yet understand it, and we still have a lot of work to do. So I think there's a lot to the sort of the need to encourage more sort of multidisciplinary conversations, which I know the UN Secretary General has also highlighted as a priority for the IGF. And I think that's very true. I think we need to do more to get outside of our digital internet governance bubble, to go talk more in gender spaces about digital dimensions and vice versa. And I think also the Best Practice Forum and similar sort of policy spaces need to probably do more to invite more gender experts and people working in, you know, complementary fields. So that's just sort of a point in terms of trying to pick up on some of the recommendations and findings that Serena has highlighted. I think, and some of you might know that Research ICT Africa was recently commissioned to do an analysis of data which we have available around participation in the IGF over the past, since the IGF was created. And among other things, we looked at gender or male-female participation. And I think, you know, there's a lot of really interesting findings in what we've come up with. I'll try and share my screen. I don't know if that's going to be possible, but let's see. And while I try to do that, I'll just explain that what we did is we looked at the annual participation data that we have for annual IGFs. And basically, we sort of tried to assess various dimensions of it. One of it was gender. And as Serena mentioned, a big problem is that most of our data that we have only see gender in the binary male-female. Since 2017, we've had the category other, which very few people have actually responded to. So, I mean, I think the other dimension is around 2%. I think that, you know, that's a very easy fix, and that you can better define what we mean by other. I don't think anyone really enjoys being defined as an other. But broadly speaking, participation from women, females have improved since 2006. It used to be around 30%, it's now around 42%. So that's broadly speaking a positive thing. And in terms of sort of stakeholder groups, there's always this sort of allegation that civil society are way more active, and especially women from civil society. To some extent, that's true, because most of the stakeholder groups, we have more men participating than women, except for civil society. And then we also we looked at, and I think this is kind of interesting and also worrying, we tried to look at the intersessional activities at the IGF and try to analyze to what extent there's actually active participation in these activities. And I mean, while the findings are very much provisional, they tend to show that there's kind of decreasing participation and less active participation, that most of the participation on the mailing list seem to come from IGF staff, and that a few of the same people keep on sending messages. And I say that because I think it's interesting and it's important to note that we need to probably do more to ensure that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're doing enough to make sure that that isn't just a tokenistic notion. And I think Serena also mentioned that in her recommendations, and it's quite a hard thing to do. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. Going beyond tokenistic sort of tick box approaches is a difficult thing to do. but that's that's partly why the Best Practice Forum has a good job ahead of it, to think of how we can talk about these things. And I think, and to some extent, it can be quite influential in other policy spaces in trying to set a trend and showing how do we better ensure that we don't just have, tick boxes to measuring things like participation that just goes to male, female, and other, for instance. How do we ensure that people are actively participating? I saw in the chat that someone was mentioning that it's difficult to know how to participate. How do we make sure that people know, what the ins are? And I think that's sometimes difficult, especially when we talk about more difficult or sort of controversial topics that might invite discomfort, as Henriette is also saying on the chat. I think, and someone else said to me recently around a conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that we all just need to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable and asking questions. And maybe that is a good sort of starting point. But I think that's enough from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. Thank you very much for this comprehensive intervention and for sharing the findings of your organization. And I really echo your concerns about moving beyond this sort of echo chamber and moving beyond this bubble at the IGF where everyone is at their comfort zone, basically. And it's good to challenge the way it has always been challenged. And I guess one of these ways is to move beyond this tendency to just frame this thematic from that negative perspective. I guess we would need also to be more focused on the pleasure part, the consent part, and the women's agency part. But also the agency of people of diverse gender and sexualities, because I still think it's often overlooked within these spaces where we more see how the internet related spaces are harmful for people, are violent and are abusive. Whereas I guess we have a lot of potential to unleash when it comes to giving people that agency to just embrace themselves and their identity online. And so I guess we still have a bit of time if some of the panelists would like also to jump in, or if the participants have any questions for Henri. I'm seeing some comments. Yeah. I'm just seeing some, reading some comments about the discomfort that talking about sex, pleasure, consent, and and gender, not as in the gender divide, but more from that feminist perspective, creates that sort of discomfort within these policy spaces. And I know that it's very that it's very hard to tailor these sort of interventions for different audiences. Perhaps if Avery.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a panelist. I'm Avadoria. I'm a panelist later, but just so that there would be no responses. or so that there would be no responses. One of the things I'm wondering is, I have not been actively involved with the IGF for the last couple of years, was not involved at all in the BPF. So I'm coming from reading, I'm coming from observing, but I'm wondering how comfortable it was actually working on the BPF within the current IGF. Is the IGF a safe space for these conversations? Has it been? I know from my first years of involvement in the IGF, when before Jack sort of broke it open with one of her presentations in the first years, it wasn't unmentionable. Now it is mentionable. One can talk about the broad umbrella of gender issues, but how safe did it feel? How welcome did the conversation feel to those of you in the BPF at this point? Thanks.
Very much indeed. It has opened the floor for conversation, and I guess that's a good starting point, and that's why we're trying to dig into that issue. Chennai, you had a question, right?
Yes, so thank you so much for Serena and Henry for being in this conversation, and also just following up on the question that Avery has raised. So in addition, I think, start my video. Sorry, the host was starting my video. So I think in addition, for me is, of addition to Avery's question, is also in both your reflections, Henry and Serena, and whoever else participated in the actual review of this work, would the IGF be a space where we can actually talk about women as having agency, and women and gender diverse people as actually having agency, and a need to have policies that respond to that with pleasure and consent? Or is the IGF space more kind of like, as Anget is talking about, the discomfort about sex, is the UN space more kind of like, we have to be conservative and we're trying to protect, therefore we're not going to engage in this issue? So I'm sort of like just juxtaposing the 2 points, but I think that's something that's quite important to reflect on. Is the IGF the space for this conversation, or should we go to the UN Women's Group, for example?
Thank you, Chennai, for that very poignant question. I don't know if Henry, you would like to jump in, or anyone else?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm glad Avery brought up Jack, and again, the sort of the fact that it was really uncomfortable, because I think it's also important to note that that's maybe 6-7 years ago. It's not that long. I mean, I know it's a long time in the history of the internet, but it's not that long. So I kind of, and to Chennai's point as well, I mean, I don't think the fact that something is uncomfortable should mean that we shouldn't speak about it. In fact, that's, the opposite. I think that we should definitely be speaking about women's agency. I really like the fact that you've framed it as such. I think agency is a very fraught topic, but in fact, around what's happening today around whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it data colonialism or algorithms of oppression, or any of these sort of fancy academic terms, we really need to be interrogating things around agency, and especially so for women and people who are typically left out of the equation. And I think this is definitely the space to do so. I think if anything, as I said in my earlier intervention, is I think we might have been a little bit amiss in not doing more to reach out to other fora to bring it there more. And I know in the early years of the Best Practice Forum, we did work quite closely with UN Women, ITU, Equals, etc. And maybe there's a need to do that again, but it also goes both ways. They also need to work more with the IGF. So I think, I think there's definitely a need for more sort of cross-fertilization between spaces. And again, the need to deal with discomfort and to talk about it. And I really, again, really like the framing of agency, although that would require us to also talk about power and where the power lies and why certain people feel excluded. So I think, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's something we often neglect, just talking about what are the barriers to having more people in a more diverse space. And I think one of the comments was around the difficulty of knowing how to participate. That's a barrier that should be quite easy to address, but it does require a lot of hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that. Yeah, and I guess it also goes back to the language question and how we can tailor it for different audiences and stakeholders. Henriette, you have the floor.
Thanks, Marwa, and thanks everyone. Thanks, Serena, for a great report. I think the answer to that question that we're discussing, yes, I think the IGF is the right place, but I think that we need to think where in the IGF and in what way. I think, and the part of in the what way, I think applies not just to this work, but I think to IGF work in general. You need to, I think, especially for a best practice forum, I think the narrower your focus, the more effective you can be in raising the issue. I think the reason that the best practice forum on violence, online gender-based violence worked well, and there are various reasons. I think the one is that it was a very narrow focus. The second is it was being discussed broadly. And in fact, APC and its partners who were part of this best practice forum had done a lot of research around the world. So you had a kind of a bottom-up approach because APC had these voices of sex workers in the Philippines, for example. They had the voices of feminist groups in Latin America talking about their experience of online gender-based violence. It was a big project. So there was a lot of evidence and voice that would inform that process and come into some kind of policy recommendations on a common problem. The problem was gaining recognition. So you even had, in the IGF context, other stakeholders. You had government, you had business, technical community interested, willing to contribute. And I also think you had, to some extent, the freedom of expression advocates who had been very opposed to even considering any kind of recognition of the need to control or regulate or prevent harmful speech. They had also kind of come to the table. So the circumstances came together. I think with other topics, it can be quite hard, but I think you need to think what you're talking about. So let's take pleasure and consent, for example. The whole issue of erotic content and sex and pornography on the internet is actually one that involves a lot of people. A lot of people are interested in it. Think of all the businesses that are making money out of it. So I think the challenge is, how do we get that topic to be discussed at the IGF in a way that brings Pornhub to the table, and where there can be more confrontation, more debate about, how do we actually look at sex, sexual experience, sexual expression, sex business on the internet, sex work on the internet, in a way that's more inclusive. And I think that, to me, that is what's really challenging. And I think that while there's a coherence to the feminist analysis being applied to a best practice forum, I think it inevitably excludes a lot of participation, because there are just so many people who kind of just run a mile when they see the words feminist analysis. And I mean, and I might find that annoying, but that doesn't, I think in the IGF context, if you want to have results in the form of a best practice forum, you have to find a way of making your framing somewhat broader. And maybe for me, and I've been learning a lot since I've been MAG chair, about the difference between dynamic coalitions and best practice forums. And I think in some way you can be a lot more radical and a lot more creative in a dynamic coalition. Let's say a dynamic coalition on the feminist principles of the internet, for example. But in a best practice forum, if you go in with a feminist framing, you are going to struggle, to get all the kind of, the multi-stakeholder buy-in that you kind of have to have in an IGF context. So for me, it's not that whether it is the IGF or not. I think the IGF is the right space, but I think we have to be tactical. We have to be realistic about what type of strategy and approach works best in what type of IGF platform. And in that sense, I think dynamic coalitions might be a lot better for pursuing this feminist approach in the internet and then in the IGF, and then you can still bring that to bear to a best practice forum. But yeah, I mean, I'll stop at that. I think so. The answer is yes, but we've got to be careful and realistic and tactical about the limitations of a multi.
Thanks, Henriette. I guess we've lost you at the last point, or just me. But in all cases, I really echo your points about, creating that sort of third wave of the BPF within the IGF itself, because the IGF holds a lot of potential to pave the way for such conversations. And I guess I would hand it over to Bruna for the second panel. So yeah, thanks everyone. Bruna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marwa, Henri, Henriette, and Avery for this excellent discussion. I was live tweeting and very happy with what I was listening to. But I would maybe inverting a little bit of the discussion or changing kind of our direction on this. I would start by echoing a comment from Henri that when she said that it's interesting and important for us that we need to do more when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just so that we do this in a way that it's not tokenistic. And also this past points of discussion in which we were talking about this discomfort and also how to ensure that we can move towards the moment of cross-pollination and so forth. So the discussion right now is more focused on the IGF and policy spaces. And the idea here is to discuss with Avery and Jennifer and whoever else wants to join the policy context of all of these issues that we have been presenting right now. And so my question to you would be, in what way some of the recommendations provided by the BPF are applicable to the Internet Governance Forum or other policy spaces around Internet governance? So I think I'm gonna hand the floor to Avery first and then Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. And let me repeat what others have said about Serena's report. It was very good reading, and actually learned a lot from it, because the violence, harm, pleasure, and consent aren't subjects that I've given a whole lot of thought to before reading it. Always looked at the gender issue in terms of inclusion, in terms of access, because those are such big problems and remain such big problems. But and then perhaps, except for the consent issue, which has sort of very much entered a legal realm where it's actually being spoken of. So very grateful for that. I do sort of wish there had been greater data samples for the data, because they are small sample sets, and trying to think about that as a first issue is sort of, how does this work get done? And it is a very broad umbrella we're looking at here, you know, going all the way from sex to the legal issues of consent and such. So how do we then zero into actually getting things done, actually getting things into policy, getting considerations into policy? Now, one of the things that occurs to me is that while those of us in the bubble that are even willing to talk about it, even willing to sometimes say the words, don't sort of realize or don't work that much with those who don't even understand that there are such concepts, that there are such issues, and they are looking at their very narrow areas of policy. And when they're looking at them, and then you basically, but how does this fit within a feminist set of principles? How does this deal with the issues of gender? You hit a blank wall. You basically hit a place where the conversational frameworks are so separate that they do not know how to even apply the concepts. And this is not to in any way judge people's ability to apply the concepts, but basically I think that there's a certain amount of translation needed where people who are concerned, who are doing theoretic work, who are, steeped within the theme of violence and harm, or of pleasure, or of consent, can sort of dig into the other issues and say, this is the place, these are the sentences, these are the words, these are the concepts that apply specifically in the view that you're looking at. Now, that means having a fair number of people with a fair broad set of understanding so that you can go to the various DCs. I was thinking back to the DC that I'm coordinating on schools and internet governance. And as I was reading this report, I said, gee, we never talked about that. And I'm even someone who should know what I'm talking about. I'm even someone who should maintain an awareness of it. And yet, looking at the schools and internet governance and even thinking through the curricula that we've started to talk about, that issue did not figure in. And so why, even when you have people who are aware of the topic, not actually connecting it to the details of the other policy issues, the policy issues that are affected of it, we're not actually thinking about it, let alone people to whom the whole issue was, was forbidden and perhaps still is. Henry was referring to 5-6 years ago. The first time that Jack brought up the concepts was in the 5 years that I spent as a member of the Secretariat, where she brought up sexuality in a regular main session. And the Secretariat had a crisis. Can we include this? Can we list it in the transcript? And had all sorts of delegations that were like, how could you talk about such things? So we have come a long way. We can talk about it now, but still connecting it to the policy themes. So, when asked, how does the IGF go further on it? First of all, as you've said, inclusion. I think the idea of including questions is good. Including questions that ask people, not specifically perhaps, what are you doing for diversity? What are you doing for gender? But questions that are more considerations. Have you considered this in the planning of? How, have you considered that in the planning? And sort of getting into more detail that asks them to look at their considerations specifically. So I think there's a lot of value in that. I think the report cards are good. I think anything that anybody makes mandatory is a problem, but that may be my own particular fetish on things that are mandatory. So I think there's a persistence that is necessary. I think that there's a focus that is necessary, that basically takes people that understand both the gender issues and the other issues that are being spoken of and can translate. In other words, it's important to use our own language. It's important to use our own framing. It's important within our own thematic work, within our own framework building. And yet it's also important to be able to translate that in a tactical sense to the language that other people are using when creating the policy so that they understand. It very similar to things that Henry mentioned about, I think it was Henry, about, or maybe it was Chennai, please forgive me, that, you know, talking to the South Africans, talking about, yes, there is domestic violence online, but basically having to basically do a translation. So I think that is a tactical part that really needs consideration. And it means focusing on lots of things. It means perhaps in the construct of a dynamic coalition, focusing on looking at the work that others are doing and how can we import our knowledge? How can we import our concerns? How can we import the feminist analysis, perhaps even without using scary words at first, and explaining it and then say, oh, by the way, that was a feminist analysis, as opposed to at the front door saying, and all ye who enter here prepare for a feminist analysis, and not to negate the agency or the drive to use our own terminologies in these discussions. You know, and likewise, because the question goes to when you take it outside the IGF, it really involves understanding the constraints that other people are talking within. It involves the understanding their language. It understanding the way they talk, the way they tactically, because people accept new ideas kind of when they're slipped in, but they back off and get defensive at times when things come on in language they don't understand, with pressures that they feel being put upon them. And that doesn't excuse that, but it does make it a tactical necessity to get around it if you're going to actually, you know, achieve anything with policy processes. So I think that sort of persistence, that sort of making tactical decisions, that sort of doing an analysis that goes deeply into how does my topic, how does consent, how does harm, how does pleasure map to the discussions that others are having. And that's hard work that can be done in a place like the IGF, that can be done in a place where talking about models is reasonable. You know, go to a lot of other places and start talking about models and say, no, we're here to talk about protocols. We're here to talk about this. We're here to talk about that. We're not here to talk about grand visions. We're not here to talk about models of social justice or a feminist framework. So how do you then bring it down to that? And I think the IGF, especially in the DCs and in sessions, when in the IGF we notice main sessions being set. So is there someone that is on the panel that is capable of bringing up those issues? So working with the groups that are setting up panels to make sure, not necessarily that there's a woman on each panel, or perhaps if you have a panel of just women, that there's a man on each panel, but making sure that you know, there's someone who is able to talk about the issues under discussion in that framing, to be able to bring those issues, to be able to ask those questions. Very often use a Platonic style can help, where as opposed to telling people what's going on, what they should be thinking about, you're asking questions that lead them to thoughts that are relevant, thoughts that will actually affect the policies that are being made. I don't know how long I've been talking and waving my hands, but I think I'll stop then and now. And then if there are questions, talking this early in the morning is tricky. But basically, you know, maybe there'll be questions later after Jen has talked or what have you. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Ari. And before I pass the floor on to Jen, I think that you've touched upon a lot of some of the recommendations and points of convergence between our recommendations as well. And specifically on the framing and how it is important for us and for everyone in this space to make sure that the framing is taken forward and that this sort of inclusion is just not something that's on the paper or just something that's relatively mentioned in IGF and at like IG forums or even schools and so on and so forth. So one of our recommendations for beyond the IGF was to foster this sort of linkages between those processes and inviting people to contribute to the IGF discussions, but also help with the activities focused on other thematic issues. And I'm gonna pass this discussion to Jennifer right now, because we know Jennifer works for .Asia and is also somebody who has been within APRIGF. So Jennifer, maybe if you can bring a little bit of your experience on rather how to include these topics in different forums beyond the IGF, or anything you would like to add to this discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bruna. Of course, first of all, I want to echo all the speakers and panelists before me. Reading the report from the BPF Gender is actually really enriching. There's a lot of really good points that are actionable. There are a lot of data sets that are analyzed, and I actually also echo what Aubrey said before me. It is a shame that the sample size is a bit small, but then I think that is one of the things that can be actionable, right? If we're looking at the trends, looking at where we should be going, that's one of the things we can start improving on. And I think the IGF and also the MAG as well have improved in the years since Jack opened the door to making this a more normal conversation. So I think having more data means probably looking at every part of the chain, right? I heard a lot from Henri earlier, and it's really encouraging to see the statistics of participation, at least the categories there, able for people who are non-binary, who do not, subscribe to, traditional male, female, what have you, a place where they can express that, this is what I identify with. So this is actually an improvement from previous years. But I think more than that, so we should look at it in the scope of the entire arc of the process. So of speaking a little bit with the MAG member hat on right now, is that from the beginning of the process of the year, the cycle of the IGF, we have issue scoping. We go to the community to ask them what they want to talk about. And I think, of course, we do get a lot of input from various sectors, various regions, various people who represent different community stakeholders. But I think we need to go a little beyond that as well. There's a feeling, actually 2 years ago since Paris, that from the speech of the Undersecretary General of the UN, Secretary General of the UN, is that we want to find the people that we want to bring into the IGF space. We need to reach out to these underserved communities, reach out to the marginalized communities. So in the very beginning of the process, the issue scoping, we should actually not only just open the door and say, hey, everybody can come in and tell us what we want, what you want to hear at the IGF. We need to go to these communities that tackle these issues, and to these communities where we want to hear from and ask them specifically. So it's not just opening the door. We have to go to their door, knock on their door and say, hey, we want you here, and please tell us what you want to talk about. Please tell us what is important to you in this context. So that's number one. And then I guess moving on a little bit more to when we're talking about consultation as well, to bring in more gender experts from, gender experts, people who work in this field. I mean, I must admit, I myself I'm not a gender expert. I have a lot to learn, both from the report and all the panelists who spoke before me. But within the space where you create this work, we need to bring in that. And I think Henri also touched on the cross-pollination issue with working a little bit more with agencies, UN agencies such as UN Women or other organizations that do specifically tackle these issues. So bringing in the gender experts you want to hear from as well, to kind of level up the knowledge of people who are interested in this space as well. And then another point in the process is you need representation. Now, I know a lot of us have already talked about, we need to move beyond tokenism, but the image that we project is also really important. And the image we project starts not only with who we're asking to come and speak at the panels, who we're actually including into the MAG, who we're asking to speak at high-level sessions, And I think a lot of us have noticed that, of course, through the years, this has improved a lot, but it also depends on the different buckets, on the different themes that the IGF really holds. Now, in the inclusion theme, in the access theme, in the rights themes, there is quite a robust representation of women, of people who are marginalized, people with disabilities, people who identified as non-binary, but in other areas that is not so much the case. And I think myself, coming from a background, I mean, for .Asia, we sometimes are considered a technical community, sometimes we're considered private sector, but I see a lot fewer people, women, people who come from these communities in this space, discussing technical items, discussing cybersecurity. Lots of the times, the panels or the experts gathered around these tables are less diverse. And there could be good reasons, historic reasons about that, but that also doesn't mean we don't have the responsibility to reach out to create at least the image that we project out to people that this is a welcome space for you to also participate in. Now moving on to a little bit of, I guess, the logistics part of the whole, arc of work in IGF. I guess in the workshop proposal, like logistics and forms, where we ask people, I think I saw in the chat earlier, the beginning of the session, I think it might have been from Amrita, that if we actually ask workshop proposers what they plan on, or if they plan on involving gender issues within the discussion, not that we're saying you have to talk about this is the only topic you talk about, but in the context of framing different issues in the Internet Governance Forum, in IG, are you planning to talk about this with a different perspective as well? I think that's really important. That gets people thinking about what kind of policy questions they want to put into a proposal. And then I think the post-session report is also important. I know people have said, gender report card is great, how do we improve it? And this year, I mean, I am responsible for organizing one of the main sessions. Clicking on the, quick report, I already see there's questions there that ask, did you talk about gender issues in your panel? And I think that's really important too, because it's like, not only are you asking, was this talked about, there should be other dimensions you're looking at as well. So it could be that, the main subject of any panel may not be particularly based on gender or that, but the nuances of the issues that are talked in between could be teased out that way. And lastly, I don't want to take too much time. I do want to leave some more time for people to ask questions and have a more robust discussion is data. So from the APRGF point of view, we actually started working with BPF Gender, I think since 2016 or 17. I do recall when we were in Bangkok, which is 2017, we did have a joint session with BPF Gender talking about this, kind of introducing, taking statistics, having a gender report card. And that was a really successful session. It was a very interesting session. And since then, in our post-session reports, we've also included that. We've also included questions, were these discussed? What was the gender balance on your panel? And these are the questions that every time a workshop comes in, they are accepted, they are implemented at the actual forum. The post report is actually very important because I guess a little bit of context in APRGF, we also do look at the post-session reports, how the session was already conducted, and that does have a knock-on effect of whether or not, these same organizations or same proposers next year will have a successful, workshop coming through. And then finally, I think I want to move my intervention back to the BPF. I think that a lot of us have already said, we see a lot of the context of the IGF when we talk about gender being based into inclusion and access. And I think what is interesting is the name of the BPF is BPF on Gender and Access. And I think this was something that was implemented or suggested by the MAG either 2 years ago or 3 years ago. My memory is a bit fuzzy now. And I think linking these two at the very top in the name of the BPF already kind of brings the direction this way, right? It brings the direction this way, and people who participate in this BPF coming in new, who already have a preconceived, at least a notion that this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about gender and access, and that's kind of it. So a suggestion, maybe if we want to move it to somewhere different, if we want to move it beyond that, you have to start with the name. And another thing I want to pick up on, the last point I want to pick up on that Avri mentioned is, and also Henriette mentioned, is finding a balance and finding a tactical approach in being able to talk about what we want to talk about, because it's important to have people you need at the table. And if you kind of gate that at the beginning with a title or something like that, it's not going to be possible. And you need to also balance it, because you don't want it to become an echo chamber, but at the same time, you also don't want it to become a space where it's not comfortable for everybody to participate. And finding the commonalities is something that's really important, I think. I think I'll stop here and see if any others want to jump in.
Thank you very much, Jen. And thanks to all who have been contributing to this discussion on the chat. I guess now we have a space for anyone who wishes to ask for the floor or to add anything to these discussions. On the chat so far, we have been a lot of comments on this need for the change in the BPF's name, and also some other points in our involvement in policy processes, and how the BPF is committed to continue working on this. So I'm going to open the floor again. So if anyone wants to join, please raise your hand or just open your microphone. Okay, seeing as we say, and I can as well, seeing on and hearing on, but I think,
Bruna,
go ahead.
Yeah, can we just look at the recommendations? Because I think you and your team and Serena have some very concrete, practical recommendations in the report. And it might be interesting to get people's perspectives on those recommendations. I know Serena showed them earlier, but maybe if we can just look at them again and reflect on how to work with them.
I am sharing my screen now. I think you can see them properly. Let me know if I need to make it slightly larger or not. But the recommendations were divided into 4 streams. And Sorina, if you want to jump in into this discussion and help me with this. But the 4 streams were gender mainstreaming at the IGF, integration of discussions on violence, harm, pleasure, and consent, gender diversity at the IGF and beyond the IGF. So this would be the first stream of them.
Thanks a lot, Bruna. And maybe if we can jump to the one on data, because I think the fact that Anri shared earlier that she's been doing this research that we managed to get some support from ISOC for, and the research turned out to be very complicated because of the data, because of the IGF has limited capacity, and therefore even the gathering of data. So it might be useful because we are going to look at how to, in the light of Anri's research, which is about participation broadly, not just in terms of gender, we are going to come up with some recommendations to the Secretariat on data. So I wonder, Anri, seeing as you've looked at both this and your own experience of doing the research, what are the recommendations that we would like to see put into practice, let's say from January, post this IGF, January 2021, with regard to data gathering and gender disaggregation of data?
Sorina, do you want to jump in, or any one of my BPF co-facilitators?
I think Henriette has addressed the question to Andre, so if she wants to start.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you, Henriette. I think that is a good point that we still actually need to figure out ourselves. I think there's a couple of sort of relatively easy quick fixes that could be done, and one of those is, how do we ask about participation, male, female, or other, and maybe expanding on that. I heard, or I saw, that there was a suggestion that the gender report cards be made compulsory. I think I share Avri's concern about anything that is compulsory, but I do think in the session reports, which like the workshops have to do, we might need to include more questions around participation. My concern is, in my experience is, and I'm slightly ashamed to say this, but I know how these workshop reports work, and typically, afterwards you're like, oh, I have to submit this workshop report, and you kind of sort of estimate how many people were in the room and how diverse you think it was. So I think we need to do something that's more sort of real-time assessment, and whether that means, like you have a rapporteur at the moment in each session, you might have to have someone report in each session on gender and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the more difficult things, and this is something that I'm grappling with more broadly with the IGF participation study, is that I think, broadly this kind of comes to the notion, or it speaks to the notion of multi-stakeholder participation. And at the moment, the metrics that we have in place are simply too unsophisticated to really tell us much about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we need to sort of go back to the foundations and think about why we support the notion of multi-stakeholder participation. And a lot of that has to do with the benefits of getting diverse views on issues and people from different stakeholder communities. And in one stream of that is ensuring that you have people from different stakeholder communities, and whether that is the private sector and breaking down the private sector more explicitly into sort of bigger groups, whether that is sort of big tech organizations or mobile network operators. So there's clearly a broad need for more nuance in how we ask questions about participation. I think, and what we're doing around this study is trying to really unpack how we can talk more about exclusion and inclusion and active and passive participation. And that's a harder question that might take some time to address, but at least I think we're starting that conversation. So I'm sorry, I don't think I've provided a lot of answers. I've probably provided more questions. I like some of the suggestions that Serena has made around gender report cards and making that more compulsory, or asking questions about how we include those things. Yeah.
I think those are very concrete. Serena, and what would you say are the concrete suggestions that you would like us to try and implement in the short term?
Thanks, Henriette and Andre. The BPF has made a few, as you say, concrete recommendations on maybe not so big changes that could be made as we start the new planning process. And one of them is, again, looking at the list of resource persons that we have, and probably it's not extremely well used. And that could help session organizers have more gender diversity in their sessions. And then that would also help assess how that goes. And one specific recommendation there was to consider including tags that would allow experts who are women or gender diverse people to identify themselves as such if they want to. Of course, it won't be something compulsory, but if people feel like they want to identify themselves as such, that would help. And then when a session organizer is saying, hey, we have a difficulty bringing gender diversity on the panel, we would direct them to the list of resource person, and that would be helpful. Then another recommendation was to maybe encourage session organizers themselves to invite speakers to identify themselves as such, again, if they want to, and then put that information on the workshop page or whatever, with the consent, of course. And that would help with getting data later on how exactly the gender diversity was on the session beyond men and women. So there are a few concrete and specific recommendations. Maybe we can look into some of them to put them in practice as the new cycle starts. Thank you.
If I can jump in, this is Avery.
Yes, Avery.
One of the recommendations that really sort of rang with me was the one of basically, having women and gender diverse people in sessions is not the end goal. Participation, not tokenized, nor should participation stop once the session ends. That point, and also the point in the sub-bullet about basically whether it's the IGF or a DC that's specifically focusing on this, or some other, group of people working together, of supporting presenters and participation and participants, and that sort of goes to the what I was talking about before in terms of how to basically find ways to mesh things, to basically bring the gender issues and the policy issues together, how to start merging them so that they're not separate, so that it's not just off in a bubble of people or just in a token participant on a panel, but that communication, that steady state of participation is continuous. It's why also the recommendations about the intersessional, especially when combined with Henriette's suggestion of doing something more intentional about intersessional activities, DCs and BPFs, sort of mid-year as opposed to just at the annual. If this, set of issues, if the gender set of issues is brought into there, and actual weaving in of the concerns, of the issues, of the content is done, and that kind of context, you start to get it to be more persistent, repeated more often, brought in different contexts, in different ways, planting little seeds that grow up later. But basically, that sort of effort. So I think those are important parts. One thing that I don't see here, but that occurs to me, and it's perhaps because I'm spending too much of my life prioritizing things lately, is given that this is such a broad area, not every issue is pertinent to every discussion at every point in time. So figuring out priorities for particular, main sessions, for particular DCs, for particular other organizations, is sort of not bring all of it in at once, but what is the most pertinent issue that can make headway, that can start to build the awareness. So those are things that, show up in these recommendations that I'd really recommend paying attention to as this effort moves on persistently. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Avery, and everyone who joined this part of the discussion. We're going to move it to the close-up of the session, and I'm going to hand the floor to Marwa in a few seconds, but just again, this point of continuity and also ensuring that the IGF is not broken up into parts, or before the event or after the event, was also a main concern for us this year. And before handing the floor to Marwa, we have two Q&A questions that I think at the close up, or even as we can maybe try to approach. But the first one would be, is an ombudsman position within the IGF space on the table of the discussions? And the second question is, why going with the feminist approach is an issue at the IGF, and shouldn't it be part of the solution that will change the forum itself? So Marwa, you have the floor.
Thanks, Bruna, and thanks everyone for this very thought-provoking session. I guess we all have some food for thoughts, and I guess we all agree that we need to find these sort of commonalities, but also to break the silos and try to find that third wave of keeping up the momentum within the BPF. And so right now, I'll just again hand it over to all the panelists for a closing remark. And if you want to pick up one of the questions that we have in the Q&A that Bruna just read, please feel free to just include that in your remark. Thank you. Whoever would like to go first, just take the mic.
Or maybe, if I'm interfering here, IGF this year is also about the voluntary commitments. Do our panelists think that there would be any voluntary commitments that we should take on with regards to this topic, or moving the BPF forward, or anything like that?
I can jump in. I think I'm uncomfortable with silences, clearly. I have actually learned so much in this session. So, I mean, I know everyone has said thank you, but even just for the study on participation at the IGF, I think I really liked, and I wanted to pick up on one point that I can't remember who made it, but the fact that we also need to sort of consider, I mean, there's this sort of saying about whenever you see a nail and you have a hammer, you want to hit that nail, and consider where it is actually relevant, and be much more tactical about where we talk about these things and how we talk about these things. So I really like those two kind of separate suggestions. And there were a few really interesting suggestions around, you know, having a mid-year check-in, which I think is quite doable. And if anything, this sort of virtual IGF showed us how it can work really well. So just again, a thank you from my side. I've learned a lot from reading this report. And I think if anything, it can get us going, thinking about if the best practice forum continues another year, what the focus should be. I think my vote would be for something quite narrow. I think the best practice forums that are quite narrow work really well. And then I like the suggestion of thinking of a dynamic coalition to talk about more uncomfortable subjects, potentially. So yeah, just a couple of very unorganized thoughts from me, but thank you very much. It was a great session.
Thanks. And if I can jump in, I would endorse everything that Henri just said, you know, because it does make a lot of sense. When one of the comments did ask about, shouldn't a feminist principle, a feminist way of looking at things become a norm inside IGF? And certainly that is to be hoped, but that is not something that can be stated up front. It's something that, again, will take growth. And yeah, I'm very grateful for the BPF paper. It certainly made me think about what things I'm not paying attention to in other spaces and should perhaps start paying attention to. And I would recommend others read it with that eye, is in your own spaces, what are the pieces you can bring in? When can you bring them up? And thanks so much.
I'll just jump in with just a few words, endorsing and saying +1 to what Henri and Audrey also said. I guess my final point really is to look at data. We really do need a comprehensive set of data. We want to take note where we're doing well and take note where we need to improve. And touching slightly, I think on the question of the ombudsman, I think it was already answered in the Q&A, but it's really interesting to think about it in this way. Of course, there's always a funding issue, but having a space for this to come up that doesn't like put more pressure or more workload on the IGF secretariat is always a good thing. So yeah, there's a lot of actionable points in the BPF gender report. I really do suggest that we take that forward to the MAG, to the community, to the next MAG coming up, because current MAG is already going to come down. But I think it's very, very important points that we need to work towards.
Thanks, Jen. Serena, would you like to wrap up?
I was just writing in chat, adding a thank you note to everyone who has been supporting this work. Andrea was just saying that it was good that at once we looked at the IGF itself and it was the right time. And I just wanted to add thank you, Andrea, Ayesha, Mary, and everyone else who's here and has given us a bit of time during the interview process and everything else. So many thanks for that. And as I've said at the beginning, there is still a bit of time to help us with more recommendations and more suggestions as we finalize our report. So if there's anything else you would like to add, just send us a quick email and we'll make sure to include them in the consolidated report to be ready at the end of the IGF. And many thanks.
Thank you, Serena, and thanks to all of our panelists and attendees. And just like Serena said, we're still open for inputs, comments, recommendations, just keep them coming in. And I guess that's it. Right, Bruna?
Just to add my thank you as well and ask everyone to please join the BPF if you haven't yet. So this is a work that we plan to continue, and this was a great session that I hope sets the rhythm for the next year. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.